This is my simple how-to guide of how I take care of my sourdough starter and make the easiest artisan bread and the most delicious sourdough pancakes ever. Often taking care of sourdough and baking with it can feel so daunting and complicated, but I like to keep my sourdough as simple and easy as possible so I can always have on hand gut-friendly breads and baked goods. This is so helpful, especially when I'm raising a toddler. I hope this easy flow can help simplify your sourdough and life too. Each week I make 1 or 2 loaves of sourdough bread, and I make it in the easiest, laziest way possible. I've been making it for about 10 years now. I've just kind of came up with this way that is lazy and easy, and it works every time. My purpose for making bread is my body is really sensitive with all sorts of food, and I have a hard time with buying foods from the store that are pre-made. I feel like it's just the cheapest way and the safest way for me to eat bread without getting sick. That's my intention with making sourdough. I know it's a whole art for some people, and for me it's really just a way that I can eat bread without getting sick on a regular basis. So for the longest time, all I had was a cast iron pan and glass bowls. That's how I would make my sourdough bread. Austin's mom has actually gifted me a lot of tools like a dough hook and sourdough baskets and a few other things. So I'll show both ways that you can do it, just like the easiest way with no tools, and then how I do it now with the basket. Honestly, you don't need much. You just need a glass bowl and a Dutch oven. I also know that there's ways that you can cook it in the oven without a Dutch oven, but I've never done it, so you can look that up elsewhere if you really want to go as minimal as possible. In the description below, I'll share the instructions and the details for everything, but I feel like it helps to have a visual of how I do it, and I wanted to do this because I always gift my friends and people I know sourdough. I feel like it'd just be nice to send them to this video, honestly. Likely, if you're watching this, I've gifted you a sourdough start, so hi! This is the easiest and simplest way that I do it. So last night I fed my sourdough starter. I put about 1 cup of sourdough discard that I store in the fridge, and then 2 cups of water, 2 cups of flour. I like to mix the water and the starter together first and stir it up really good so it mixes well before I add the flour. I just find that it mixes best when I do that, but honestly, you could just throw it all in together, whatever works best for you. Okay, this is the most important step. If you don't do it, then you can never make sourdough again. I take a 2-cup glass mason jar and I fill it about halfway full with the bubbly sourdough. I use the plastic lids because sourdough will eat through metal, which is probably toxic and just not good for your metal. And then I will just put this in the fridge. So just make sure to feed this once a week. There have been times where I haven't fed it for a few weeks and it stayed alive and worked, but just to be safe, I would just feed it once a week, and you could use it more, but I would say once a week minimum is the best. And so I just keep it in my fridge. I know sourdough seems really complicated because some people will feed it every day and then they'll just have this like overabundance of sourdough, or they're either cooking sourdough every day, and I don't have time to maintain sourdough every day. This is like a once a week thing for me. I store it in the fridge, and this is what it looks like fresh out of the fridge. It has this liquid stuff on top. You can either dump it off or you can mix it into the sourdough. It will just make it more sour tasting. So if you like that sour flavor in the sourdough, you can keep that in there. I like to just dump it out, but this is what it looks like. It kind of goes flat. It's not as bubbly. And some recipes call for sourdough discard that you can use right out of the fridge. So if I ever have extra, I'll just save it in the fridge and then I can use it in different recipes, but I always have a reserved 1 cup that I use to feed and continue, because if you throw that away or if you just make your recipes without taking that sourdough out, then you have to get another starter. You're done. You've used it up. And I've done that before and it's tragic, so don't do it. Now I transfer all the sourdough starter into another container because I'm just going to use this glass bowl to make the bread in. You can skip this step if you have another glass bowl. So the sourdough recipe that I'm going to share today makes 2 loaves of the traditional artisan sourdough bread. Sourdough is really forgiving. If you do a little bit less or more of something, you can always add less or more. So if you add too much liquid ingredients, you can just add a little bit more flour to balance it out. You just kind of want to find a certain texture at the end. I think that's nice because I'm not a precise exact person. I use what I need for the bread, and then with the rest of the sourdough discard, I make sourdough pancakes, which I will also share the recipe with you. It's the best thing ever. So honestly, if you have a sourdough starter and you're having a lazy week and you don't even want to make bread, just feed the starter and make the pancakes because it's easy and it'll just keep your starter healthy. So everything that you need for the bread is a glass bowl, some clean kitchen towels, a dough hook is optional but helpful, and sourdough bread baskets are optional and helpful as well, parchment paper, and a cast iron pan. Also some saran wrap to keep it sealed, but I also know some people are completely plastic free and they'll just use damp towels to cover the sourdough so it doesn't dry out. So use what you have, use what's best for you, use what aligns with your values, and that's what's fun about sourdough, is you can make it your own. So for the ingredients, you need sourdough starter, of course, bubbling sourdough starter that was just fed the night before, warm filtered water. It's important to have clean, good quality water. If it's just tap water, it can affect your sourdough starter. For the flour, I just use the organic all-purpose flour from Costco. I know some people like to use bread flour specifically for the bread, and then they use all-purpose flour to feed the starter. I just use the all-purpose flour for everything and it works just fine. And then good quality sea salt. I like Celtic salt or French salt. So yeah, that's everything you need. It's pretty simple. I use a kitchen scale and I weigh everything in grams. I know that you can measure it out, and I will add the measurements into the recipe below. I will say it's just so much more accurate and precise if you do weigh it out, but like I said, you kind of just want to find a specific texture. So if you don't have a scale and the texture seems kind of off, like it's too wet or too dry, just add a little bit of water or flour and you can balance it out pretty easily. First, I start by adding sourdough starter to a clean glass bowl. I use 120 grams of the starter. And then to the starter, I add 700 grams of warm filtered water. I mix the sourdough and water together until it's completely mixed with the dough hook. If you don't have a dough hook, you could literally just use a wooden spoon or anything you have. That is optional, but I find the dough hook really mixes the stuff great together. And then now I add 18 grams of sea salt, and then I mix it even more to the water so the salt kind of dissolves fully through. I know other people add the salt throughout different times, but this just seems to work best for me. It dissolves in the water and then it mixes fully through the bread. Once the liquids and salts are fully mixed, then I add 1100 grams of bread flour. I mix it with the dough hook until it's shaggy, and I will wet my hands and finish mixing until it's mixed pretty good. But it doesn't have to be perfect yet because we let it sit for 30 minutes and then we do some stretch and folds. Now that the sourdough is all mixed together, you can just set it to the side, preferably somewhere warm. Sourdough likes warm places. I'm gonna let it sit for 30 minutes and I'm gonna make the pancake mix while that's sitting. So to the pancakes, I add 2 eggs, 1/4 cup of oil, a splash of vanilla, 2 tablespoons of sugar, 1 teaspoon of baking soda, and a pinch of salt. Austin's mom recently got me this dough hook, and honestly, it is worth the investment 1000%. If you're gonna regularly be making sourdough, you can just see how much easier that mixes that all up compared to a wooden spoon. But this is kind of the consistency of the pancakes. And this recipe is very flexible and forgiving too, so there's times where I'll use maple instead of sugar or coconut sugar or honey, whatever kind of sweetener that you want. I've also used bananas as a replacement for oil. You can use whatever kind of oil that you like. I either do olive oil, coconut oil, or melted butter is really yummy. I also have added pumpkin puree, I've added chocolate chips, blueberries. It is a super flexible and easy and forgiving recipe. So a big secret to these pancakes is cooking them on cast iron. They just don't taste as good if you cook them on anything else. We have this sourdough griddle, but we also will just use a regular cast iron too. It definitely is faster to cook a whole batch on a sourdough griddle because you can do more than one at a time. I like to use this avocado oil or coconut oil to cook the pancakes. They both work good in high heat. Coconut oil gives it a coconutty flavor, so if you don't want that added coconut flavor, you can use the avocado oil. Give the griddle a little bit of time to heat up before you start making the pancakes. You'll know your stove better than me. I have a gas stove and I use about a little bit beneath medium and low, but if I notice the pancakes start to get a little black, then I will lower it down, or if they're not cooking fast enough, I'll turn it a little higher. So I just made the pancakes, fed my family some breakfast. Now we do some stretch and folds for the dough. Keep the saran wrap to put back on. What you do is you take one side of the dough and you stretch it up and pull it over. And then you rotate quarter turn of the bowl and do another stretch and pull. And so you do a few of these. And as I'm doing these stretch and pulls, I'm realizing the dough is a little wet. Not a ton, but it is a little wet. So I'm gonna add a little bit of flour to it and then do some more stretch and pulls. It should be a firm ball shape of dough. And then you set the plastic wrap just right back over the top. And then you let it sit for the rest of the day. So it should be ready for about dinner time. I made this around breakfast time. And then I'll let it sit in a warm place so it can rise throughout the day. And then I'll show you the next steps when I'm ready to start making dinner. Alright, so now it's been sitting out for most of the day. You want to let it sit for at least 6 to 8 hours. You're going to want to flour the surface and dump all the dough out onto the floured countertop. So now I'm gonna separate the dough in half because we're making 2 separate loaves. I'm going to stretch out and shape the dough. I'm sure that there's people that do actual techniques to this part, but basically what I do is I just stretch it all out into a rectangle, kind of get the bubbles out of it. I fold the sides and I roll it up. I kind of just roll it into a ball. So you should have 2 even balls of dough, and then I let this sit for 10 minutes. Alright, so after the dough has sat on the counter for 10 minutes, I put it into the proofing basket, and I will also show you what I did before I had a proofing basket, and then I'll cook the 2 loaves side by side so we can kind of see the difference of what that looks like. So starting with the proofing basket, I just sprinkle some rice flour inside, make sure it's in there pretty good on all the sides. Rice flour doesn't have gluten in it, so it helps prevent the dough from sticking onto the fabric in the basket. I didn't know that for a long time, and I would just use regular flour and it would stick to the basket, and then my whole loaf would tear apart, and that was really frustrating. I scoop up the loaf and I do it upside down, so the seam side up. And then, if you don't have a proofing basket, I put a kitchen towel in a glass bowl. But I like to flour it up good before I put it in there with the rice flour. And then same as the proofing basket, flip it upside down. Let the seam side face upwards. And then for both of them, I sprinkle some rice flour on top so it doesn't stick to the top, because it will rise. And then from here you could either put saran wrap over the top, but I find using a warm, damp tea towel, I'll just place that over. As always, while the dough sits or proofs, set it in a warm place. So I'm just gonna set it close to my oven. And then you can let the dough sit anywhere from 30 minutes to a few hours, or if you want to cold proof it, you can leave it in the fridge for up to 48 hours. But before you bake it after the fridge, make sure to take it out and let it warm up to room temperature for about an hour before you throw it into the oven. Alright, so now I'm getting ready to start baking the bread. So I'm gonna start the oven at 450 degrees. And I'm going to put my cast iron pan into the oven and let it preheat with the oven. So I'll start with the loaf of bread in the bowl. So I get about this much parchment paper. So the secret to flipping it is putting the parchment paper on top of the bowl and then flipping the entire bowl over. So you could either use a knife. I like to use a serrated knife. Or if you have a scoring blade, the scoring blade can make more precise designs. But for this loaf, since I made it in the glass pan, I'll just use the serrated knife. And in different shapes every time, but I'll just do an X for now. So once the pan is preheated and the oven is preheated, I put the loaf inside of the pan, and then I pour a splash of water into the pan just on the side of the bread. Be careful doing that because the pan is really hot, so a lot of steam will rise and you don't want to burn yourself. And then I put the pan back into the oven. Bake the bread in the oven for 30 minutes with the lid on, and then after 30 minutes, take the lid off and then bake it for 20 more minutes, and then the bread is done. So the nice part about proofing the bread is that you can proof it, like I said, in the fridge for 48 hours. So I'm gonna put this bread into the fridge overnight and then I'll cook it first thing in the morning. My baby is teething right now and not in the best mood, so it just makes more sense for me to bake one loaf right now and then bake one in the morning so I can be more present with her tonight. So I'll just finish the loaf that's in the oven tonight and show you that, and then I'll finish this loaf in the morning and we can compare the two loaves and see how they turn out. Good morning. Sorry the fan is on. I just started making some beans for dinner and the fan will not turn off, so hopefully you can hear me okay. I set this bread out about an hour ago and I'm just ready to put it in the oven. I have the oven and the cast iron preheated already. Same as last night. I'm gonna take about this much parchment paper, and I like to put the parchment paper on the top and center it, and then flip it over, and you should have a nice circle of bread. As you can see, I feel like it just looks so much nicer when you do it in the banneton basket. I like to do one long cut through there, and then you can do really whatever design that you want. Some pieces of wheat just to be cute and rustic. So we can have a fancy loaf of bread and then just a basic loaf. Make sure to not burn yourself with the steam. So now it cooks for 30 minutes with the lid on, and then you take the lid off and let it cook for another 20 minutes. Why does it get more? Here's my 2 loaves of bread. This is the bread that I made yesterday, and I let it just sit in the bowl with the towel. And this one got a little burnt. My baby fell right before I was supposed to take it out of the oven, and I had to soothe her for a minute, so it got a little crispy on top, but I think it should still be fine. You can see both loaves are a little flat, so I probably should have added more flour, but like I said at the beginning, it tastes delicious, it's yummy. It's just to eat bread. It's not for aesthetic purposes. But honestly, like, this goes to show, like, you really don't need that many fancy ingredients. The one that I made in the bowl actually looks a little nicer than the one that I put in the banneton basket. But I want to cut open each loaf and see how they look. So I'll start with this loaf. You see Mom cutting open the bread. Yeah, so you can see this loaf is a little more dense and flat compared to the other one, and I think it's because it sat overnight. That is my flow of keeping my sourdough starter alive and making bread and pancakes. I hope this helps simplify sourdough a little bit more for you. If you liked this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. I also hope to keep continuing to share the little tips and tricks that help me live more simplified, more wholesome and nourished life while being a stay-at-home mom and taking care of a little toddler. And I just hope to see you more in the future. Thank you for being here. I'll see you next week. Bye.